He looked at me across the living room, thumb still on the remote, and said, without a smallness or a whisper, "You're done here." I didn't argue. I folded my hands into my lap, let the television click away at his tone, and walked out of the room as if I were someone passing through a gallery, not because I agreed with the verdict, but because argument was not the work I had come to do that afternoon. I packed a small bag, the keys jingled like punctuation, and I left the house I had signed into being long before either of them ever imagined it could be taken for granted. I didn't expect the next day to change everything. I only knew I would not return to be humiliated. I thought I might call a friend, have some tea, sleep badly, and wake convinced it had been a furious dream. Then, the next morning, there was a knock the way a court summons has, deliberate, exact, and businesslike. Roman stood at the gate in a suit that fit like an argument, a blue folder clamped under his arm. He did not smile. He did the work he was paid to do. If you enjoy true life turnarounds, subscribe. I tell that opening as a way to orient you. One sentence that sounds like an ending became the hinge of a beginning. The man who said I was finished did not expect, could not have anticipated, that paper and polish and procedure would be the tools I used to reclaim the house, and the dignity that sat inside it like the green velvet armchair in my living room. But that is the shape of what followed. There are ordinary things people think they own, the word home among them. I owned other things once, a career in the county recorder's office, long afternoons cataloging the lives and mistakes of others, a habit of reading the ink before I believed the speech. I remember a time when a deed passing across my desk felt like a marriage of names on a page. The signatures were small dramas, the stamps a state's way of saying, "We see this." I learned equipment, wax seals, the way ledger paper carries weight, the posture you take when you accept a document that will outlast you. Those years taught me how easy it is to be erased if you do not live in the language of evidence. So when Derek spoke as though the house had been given to him by applause and entitlement, I heard him in the grammar of possession, but I read him in the grammar of myth. Possession and paperwork are cousins. One is loud in the room, and the other sits dusty in a drawer, but only one keeps the account balanced. I had kept those accounts. Lena sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in the way a person folds a question into their lap. She is not unkind, she is complicated, as anyone who has loved twice, with different priorities, and a marriage that had begun as a shelter and then slowly became a battlefield. For years, she had been the person who washed my dishes when I had cataract surgery, who called me on Sundays. Then she grew used to the different rhythm of marriage, joint accounts, shared calendars, the creeping intimacy of a partner's slippers by the bed. People who marry learn to measure life in plural. It was a strange calculus to watch. What she had once had as a singular became diluted under the name of we. The command, "You're done here," felt like a domestic coup, as if a tribunal had convened while I stood mute in another room. Derek can be loud in a way that covers his fear. He waves numbers like banners, tells stories about investments as if repetition would turn them into facts. Where there is loudness, there is often something trying to conceal a smallness. I had seen that kind of sudden performative authority in courthouse lobbies, men who talk over counters because their papers are thin. It had the same sound in his voice, certainty borrowed from a moment he wanted to make last. I left without argument because in that moment, argument would have been a hand-to-hand match. I am not uninterested in confrontation. I am uninterested in being baited into losing the plot of my life. There are times when dignity is a quiet action, a departure, a closed door, a bag laid in the trunk of a car. I slept in a small hotel with lavender soap and thin curtains that morning and felt the world tilt into focus. The chair at home sat empty, the television mute. The house, with its peach cobbler smell from long ago Sunday afternoons, the green velvet armchair that held me as I read, the stack of bills in the kitchen drawer, was suddenly a contested island, and I needed to think like someone who had once recorded the islands others fought over. People who have spent a life in a records office do not forget the names of folders. I could tell you the difference between a warranty deed and a quitclaim, and I could sort out what it meant when a document was filed versus recorded. Those words are not toys, they are tools. I remember my first day at the recorder's desk, hands trembling, a clerk who took me under wing and showed me how a small misstated line can unravel a lineage. We did the work quietly, measuring each paper as if it held a pulse. There is a satisfaction in accuracy that steadies you. When the world seems like a room of loud arguments, the ledger is the place where clarity sits. In the hotel, I made a list. Lists are the architecture of a mind under stress. They make a plan look like a house. The list was simple enough. Call Andrew Sterling, find deed, pack originals, suspend utilities in my name if needed, get a bagel. Each item had a paper-thin dignity to it. I called Andrew. He is a man with a steady voice and a folder for every possible contingency. I have known Andrew professionally longer than I have known him as an ally. His training is in the sordid, cautious habit of lawyers who have seen families pivot on the hinge of a signature. He listened. He did not make promises. He offered two things, a plan and the kind of legalese that feels like scaffolding: notice, service, inventory. We spoke like people who have worked with deadlines. I say I spoke to Andrew because I did, and because it's important to say that I did not trust myself to improvise legal process. If anyone finds themselves in a similar bind, I would say, without laying out steps that belong to a lawyer, that the best defense is to know what your papers say and to get a professional who can translate them into the language the court understands. I was not looking for vengeance. I wanted a way to make the home's title do what titles are supposed to do: mark who bears responsibility. A detail that is small but stubborn. When people think of home, they often forget the dullness of the paperwork that undergirds it. A deed is not romantic. It is a thin sheet of paper that names you and gives you a lever against the louder, slipper-bearing arguments of spouses and sons-in-law. I found mine folded into a safe spot, the blue folder with the county stamp still faint on the corner. The signature line held my name like an old promise, and when I read it, I felt something like permission. Permission not to punish, but to insist that decency be legible. Before the plan moved in motion, I did something for myself that was not strategic but necessary. I dressed. The cunning thing about clothes is how they settle a person into a posture of authority. I bought a beige blazer, not because a blazer is armor, but because wearing something you like is a small act of self-respect. I had a hair appointment scheduled at an inexpensive salon where the woman who braided my hair had a way of making strangers into confidants. There was risotto at a small restaurant with a cloth napkin and a music list that did not insult the ears. These things were not indulgences, they were stitches. My neighbors came like a slow mercy. Betty, who lives 2 houses down, brought a pie and a history of near mistakes, her voice a warm, low narrative of twice missing a signature and once being saved by a lawyer's slow attention. Zoe knocked with a thermos and a comfort that smelled of black tea. She's the kind of neighbor who can rearrange a pile of boxes with a single accepting motion and make the chaos brief. Olga called me from across a fence with jokes about men and menus. She is a woman who believes in the rightness of small rebellions. Each visit was its own kind of counsel. I do not, nor did I then, bring the whole community into the legal plan. Not every neighbor should be a confidant in family affairs, but the people who live beside you see the small things that signal when something is moved. The mail piling in the box, a car always in the driveway that used to be a summer visitor's, the television left on in the afternoon. They knew Derek in a way that is tender and hard. Betty once told me, "Celeste, sometimes the house changes its tune and you forget which songs you used to whistle." That line stayed with me. Andrew came to the small parlor where my plans took shape. He has a way of not looking like anyone's enemy. His hands fold around a pen, and he will wait for the silence to become productive. We spoke about notice to quit and what gratuitous use of a property legally means when someone is living as of right but without the formalities of tenancy. I will not draw a map of the law here. That is Andrew's work. What I will say is this: legal mechanisms are not magical, but they are methodical. If a house is a room of private lives, the law adds a ledger and a calendar. I took other practical steps and wrote them in my notebook as if each item were a promise to myself. One entry read, "Suspend utilities in my name. Leave them off until further notice. Cards, free supplements. No cash transfers until accounting." It read like austerity, because it was. Freezing supplementary cards was not about cruelty. It is a way to stop bleeding where bleeding has been allowed. A bank card is a small, powerful lever. When you have seen signatures and statements like I have, you learn to watch them the way a gardener watches for rot. There was a particular inventory of items that mattered to me beyond money: the quilt on my mother's bed, the collection of small china cups I had inherited, the old radio that still caught late-night jazz if you treated it like a living thing. Each object is a map of memory. Derek seemed to lean, without saying it, on the assumption that marriage or companionship translates into entitlement. He had the air of a man who expected gratitude to be an open account, an error he mistook for inheritance. When we filed the first notice, when Roman had his folder and the sheriff's office prepared their own stack of forms, there was a small mechanical satisfaction, like tightening a screw that had been stubborn for years. The documents went where documents should, into a clerk's hand, stamped, dated. The procedural nature of it made the problem less monstrous and more addressable. I knew which drawer my deed lived in. I knew what to produce. I knew which forms would be persuasive enough for a court clerk to place a hold. There is an emotional armor that comes from paperwork. Where emotion is messy and gossipful, the record is precise. I remember sitting across from Andrew and letting him lay out the calendar for me. Notice, time to vacate, the possibility of emotion if they refused. He spoke of service of process, the act by which the law ensures people have been told formally that their rights are in question. I had served many pieces of paper as a recorder. Being on the other side of service felt like learning a new kind of dignity. At the same time, I will be honest about fear. Paperwork does not erase the tremors in your hands when you realize a home you've kept warm has been turned into a contested zone.
I had a moment, stood in the kitchen, keys in my hand, the afternoon light catching the dust motes above the counter, where the memory of my dead husband's laugh came to me in the wrong register. I can tell you what a deed looks like and how to read a title line, but I cannot tell you how to make grief take a cue and sit politely. That grief and the paperwork lived together in my days like two different songs in counterpoint. I also want you to understand Lena. She is not an antagonist in the way that the evening news likes to say. She is my daughter, and her silence the night Derek spoke felt like a small desert forming between us. She had reasons. Love is thick and complicated, and she had to reckon with the split between loving a partner and honoring a mother. There was a scene where she sat with me after I had checked into the hotel, where her eyes were rimmed as if she had been bending them against something that hurt. She said finally, "I don't know how to do both." Her voice had surprised me because it was not an argument. It was a confession. This is one of the things I carry the most gently, the way a child must sometimes choose. I do not believe in pressuring Lena onto any stage. I believe in making my boundaries legible. You cannot be forced into complicity with taking what does not belong to you without losing a piece of yourself. The question is not about winning a domestic war, so much as making sure you do not become complicit in quiet, small violences. I wanted Lena to know the law was not a weapon aimed at love, but a way to keep her ownership clear, her choices possible. There were practicalities that consumed days, visits to the bank, conversations with clerks who asked for ID and then asked again, the way that signatures spread like netting through every office. I pulled every statement I had that was relevant. I looked at years of transactions with a patience I had cultivated in the records office. I found oddities, transfers that did not line up with the calendar of our life, a withdrawal here, a duplicate charge there. Each discrepancy felt less like a scandal and more like a breadcrumb. I use the language of evidence because it is what I know. Each line on a bank statement is a fact. Facts, when collected, tell a story. People imagine conflict as thunder. Much of my battle with this problem looked like other things. Form filling, hours on hold, small briberies of coffee and patience at counters. Men in suits sometimes made the loud moves. I made the patient ones. There is a long, soft power to that kind of work. Someone once told me that the law rewards habit. The person who shows up with the paper folder is the person who the clerk will listen to. Habit and paper are quiet allies. There were a few practical lines I would not cross in public conversation. I will not give a lecture on how to execute an eviction. That is a lawyer's work, and the law varies by place.
But I will say this plainly. When you have lived in a place long enough to know the sounds of its pipes and the way the morning light falls on a certain cup, you have more than attachment. You have a responsibility to make your position known in the ledger of public records. That is what I did. I used my deed as argument and Andrew as translator. A page from my notebook during those nights reads something like this. Day 3. Speak to neighbors, secure originals, make hotel arrangements for any necessary absence, prepare clothes I can wear to court. Neutral, firm, not a uniform. I like that line, not a uniform, because it reminded me I was not preparing for some theatrical revenge. I was preparing to reclaim a room where I could choose the volume on my television. Outfit choices are small rebellions. I wore the beige blazer with a navy blouse beneath it and felt like a woman who had chosen a voice that would not scream. The blazer is not about appearance as much as about the way cloth can set the carriage of your shoulders. Men who rely on thunder rarely notice a well-chosen lapel. They are focused on the boom. There was an earlier morning, days into the process, when I walked down to the mailbox and Lena's car was gone. I sat on the front step and watched the sunlight pool on the path and realized how full the house had once been with small rituals. Breakfast plates stacked in the sink, the radio playing the program she loved, a slipper in the doorway. Those things had been contorted by someone's growing assumption that possession trumps formality. I felt something activated me then, a slow, irreversible clarifying. If I let the house be told as something else, I would lose the very record of my life. I will not pretend there was no fear of backlash. I imagined Derek turning the situation into an argument that would be ugly in public. I thought of neighbors gossiping at church, but much of what drives me is a desire to keep the rooms of my life in order. Sometimes the loudest right is the one that is quietly correct.
The law is not an instrument of vengeance. It is a ledger that helps a person restore the facts. When the service of notice was scheduled, it felt like reaching a portal. Roman, the man who knocks, was a junior associate. He came with an even stride and a face that seemed practiced for the act of not being unkind. He handled the paper as if he understood it was less about him than about the dignity of the person who had asked for it to be carried. He did not speak much. He does his work. That is how legal instruments are delivered, by professionals who remove spectacle from necessity. There was an exchange, small and brisk, when I met him at the gate. He extended a paper to me and said, "Morning, Miss Everson. Mr. Sterling asked me to deliver this." The paper was the notice. I could have chosen to read it slowly, with a ceremonial slowness, but I did not. I wanted to let the formality land and move on.
He looked up at a sound behind him. The house, I suspect, registered like a potential stage in his mind. I thought of Lena listening at the kitchen door. That night, as I prepared the records Andrew had asked me to bring, bank statements, copies of the deed, items inventoried in a list called for by his office, I found my hands moving as if a ritual part of my old job were waking up. I labeled folders the way I used to: title, accounts, inventory. Each label felt like setting a stone. My fingers traced past the quilt tag my mother had sewn on the edge of the blanket and paused. Memory is stubborn that way. It wants to be a witness. When we met in Andrew's office, the possessions of the day softened into a different light. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon oil, and the office had the quiet gravity of institutional care. Roman was there with the folder. Derek eventually came, shoulders wide and the air of someone who believes a loud voice can do the work of a ledger. The meeting was not a dramatized duel. It was a series of careful steps, a recitation of facts, a demand for explanation, the laying out of statements that would make a court clerk raise an eyebrow. Derek tried a claim the way some men try clothes. He put it on without looking to see if it fit. He spoke of possession, of how he had been caring for the place, how his life was here and therefore his rights were established. In the law, there is a concept known as adverse possession. It has strict requirements and is not the place to stand with a borrowed conviction. I did not need to lecture him on the elements, but I did point out, calmly, that possession that is to stand as a title requires openness, continuity, and a specific statutory period, things he did not meet. I am not a lawyer in demeanor, but I know how to quote a clerk's patience. There was also something else that came into that room, a set of financial statements that told a different story. Someone had been moving money like curtains, as if the life of the household were a stage set where props are traded without asking the owner of the house what should remain. I slid a paper toward Lena during the meeting. It was a brokerage statement, and the arithmetic of it read like a slow revelation. Lena's hand trembled when she touched the corner. I will stop here for a moment and tell you that this is the part of the story that smells like paper and coffee. The room, the folders, the precise date stamps. The loud argument that the television produces is nearly as consequential as the quiet drama of a ledger that shifts under your hand. That is where the truth lives. The next events after that meeting were not sudden. They were the kind of legal choreography that moves with calendars and phone calls. I had done the decisive thing, not with a shout, but with a schedule. I wanted the house reclaimed without spectacle, barricades, banners, or public shaming. I wanted boxes moved with civility rather than anger.
I wanted us, to the extent possible, to disentangle a life from a claim. But the truth is, when a person hands you news like a report, their face often tells you more than the paper. Lena looked at the broker's numbers and then at me, as if her sight had been cleared by someone wiping a fogged window. I saw the ache in her posture. I also saw a beginning of something else, the ability to choose an adult relationship with her mother, rather than a marriage that asked her to divide herself. There were, as one would expect, more phone calls. There were more forms. There were the small mercies of neighbors bringing casseroles, and the work of freezing a supplementary card that had been under someone else's thumb. Each of these was an act of taking back the account. Each made the house look less like a conquered province and more like a living room with a green velvet throne waiting for its rightful owner. That night, I photographed the deed and taped the originals into the blue folder. I wrote in my notebook, "Sleep, then do not be surprised by the courthouse. Quiet wins." The thought was not hubris. It was a meditation I repeated to study myself. The house has many ways of being your story. The law is one of them. I had chosen to let the law tell my story.
And then morning came, and with it the ordinary smallness of a postman and the extraordinary smallness of a legal knock. I stood by the window with a cup of tea and watched the delivery like someone at a theater. Roman, who I had seen in Andrew's office, efficient and humane, arrived at the gate. He had the look of someone who understood that his gesture would change the rhythm of the house. He did not shout. He did not smile. He knocked. The sound was modest and final in the way good business is final. When he left, it was not with triumph. The papers were placed on the kitchen table, as if the surface could bear the weight of what they meant. I did not watch them unfold the future like a curtain. I went about small domestic things. I rinsed cups. I checked the mail. There are times in life when endurance looks like ordinary chores. The house returned to its sound. The refrigerator hummed, the kettle clicked, the light found the hardwood. The knot in the air had changed its shape, but the room remained, patiently, a room. That is where I will pause, not at the end, not at the courthouse, but at the moment the paper had landed on the table and the house had begun to rearrange itself into legibility. The next movements, the formal inventory, the possible denial, the day removers' terry boxes, the faces of neighbors looking through windows, these are chapters I will tell. For now, picture a woman setting a tray of tea down, folding her hands, and deciding that she will do the work of returning the room to itself without spectacle. There is a quiet confidence in that decision. Not rage, not surrender, but an insistence that the record be right.
I will come back to the rest of it, how the paperwork tightened, how Lena began to choose, how the house became a classroom for the neighborhood, how I repainted the walls and held tea for the women who had watched. But for now, know the sound of a knock that is neither a threat nor a blessing, but an instrument of process. It was a sound that woke a ledger into motion and reminded me why I had learned to read ink, because documents, when read correctly, restore right. The paper lay on the kitchen table like a small, unremarkable island, white, stamped, the corner slightly dog-eared where a hand had gripped it and then let go. I made tea because making tea is a habit that steadies the hands. The kettle sang, and I poured, and for a while the house acted as if nothing had been rearranged. That is one of its kindnesses, the way it can hum on as if the architecture of your life is merely furniture and not a ledger to be read. I opened my notebook and wrote, in a slow, careful hand, "Prepare inventory. Do not watch the windows. Eat." Those instructions sound silly in a diary, but they kept me practical. The day a house is contested, the interior has its own economy of small decisions, what to wear to a meeting, whether to eat or skulk, whether to answer the phone or let it go to voicemail. Andrew had told me to bring originals to the office, to let the clerk see them in the light. It is a small thing, to insist that a document be seen in the open. People talk about honesty as if it were a feeling. In my work at the recorder's office, I learned that visibility is a different kind of moral muscle. When a paper is shown, it lends weight to whatever story you tell. The inventory process that followed was at once painstaking and strangely intimate. I made a list of the things that were not valuable in a banker's sense, but were anchors for me. My mother's quilt with its thumb-worn squares, a set of enamel cups with tiny chips that matched the chipped tooth in my own smile, the radio that caught late-night jazz, a photograph of my husband in the county fair, laughing like someone who had never yet learned the cost of small cruelties. I wrote the items down as if I were naming witnesses. When Roman had delivered the notice, it set the calendar in motion. The law moves on its own rhythms. Dates fall like pebbles into a pond, and you watch circles spread. Andrew explained the next steps with the patient cadence of someone who had placed many such pebbles: inventory, potential motions, the time for vacating, and the possibility of a formal eviction if no one left voluntarily. He emphasized, as he always did, that outcomes were never promises bookended by signatures. They were the results of a chain of events, some legal, some human. I mention this because I have seen stories in which the law is treated as a deus ex machina. It is not. It is a process that requires people to show up and do the small, exacting things.
The motion of gathering evidence took on the aspect of an old job. I separated papers into folders labeled as if for an exhibit: title, accounts, correspondence, inventory. I placed the deed in the front, not out of pride, but out of arithmetic, the way a ledger needs its first line to balance. I have said before that a deed is not romantic. It is thin, yes, but it convenes reality in a way that words alone rarely do. When you hold your name under the light and see the stamp, it is a kind of return. Lena called me that evening. Her voice was flattened by fatigue, the sound of someone making a decision in slow motion. She had been to the office, she said, and she had seen some of the numbers. More than that, she had felt them as a violation.
The conversation we had was neither theatrical nor resentful. It was the careful unpeeling of a knot. She said, "I never wanted to be part of a thing that erased you." The admission felt like the opening of a small doorway. It is important to me to describe Lena with gentleness, because her choices are not a part of my triumph. They are the work of a woman learning to live apart from coercion. She spent nights sleeping on the sofa as if proximity would tell her what to do. She began to come to my room often, sitting on the edge of the green velvet armchair and listening as I talked about simple things: how to label envelopes, where I kept the stamps, what a canceled check looks like. She wanted practicalities and satellite ordinances. She wanted to be able to say, months from now, that she had not been blind. There are practicalities that feel like solaces. I called the utility company and asked that for my name they suspend service alerts. I explained I needed the accounts in my name to be reviewed. The customer service representative was kind and slow and did not know the intimacy of our house. I do not tell you this to give instructions. I mention it because we are often surprised by how administrative actions can produce emotional relief. When you see a bill returned to your account as inactive, it has the quiet effect of making a boundary visible. There are other things you cannot insulate yourself from. Rumors begin their work in rooms, and neighbors begin to place their chairs at particular angles. Betty knocked the day I was compiling the inventory and brought over a tray of sandwiches. She sat at the kitchen table and asked me about the quilt. "If you don't mind," she said, "I'll take it when you are tired of lugging it." She meant it as lightness, a way of saying she was available. Zoe came with a thermos and a plan for a neighborhood meeting. Olga brought a radio program recommendation and a joke about how men forget birthdays but remember bills. Their attendance was both social and strategic. They were a kind of informal witness to the life the house had kept. There was a moment in the middle of the legal motion when money transformed from ledger to betrayal.
I had gone to the brokerage statements at Andrew's request, not expecting to find what we found. The numbers were not simply missing. They had been shifted. A withdrawal here, a transfer there, some accounts rerouted with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned how to move a line in a bank's immensity. It felt like theft that had a bureaucratic vocabulary. I passed the papers across the table to Lena, who had come to the meeting. She sat there with the paper light on her lap, and her hand shook. Derek's face when confronted with numbers was different from his bluster in the living room. It is curious how people perform certainty when they have narrative theater, and then contract into smallness when faced with arithmetic that does not fit their script. He tried to explain the transfers as investments, risks, opportunities, the usual clutter of excuses. We listened without spectacle. Andrew's pen moved. His face remained neutral, which is something you learn to respect in a professional. He asked for documentation and began to lay out a plan for an accounting for third-party verification. This is a place where a lawyer's function is crucial. I say again, if you find yourself in a similar situation, consult a qualified attorney. The law has different rules in different places, and an experienced professional is the person who translates your papers into the legal language that the court will understand. We agreed on terms that were not punitive in tone, but were necessary in structure. There would be 30 days to vacate if Derek and his belongings remained. Utilities in my name would remain off. Any threats or attempts to manipulate access would be handled by law enforcement if necessary. There were additional threats: access to particular heirlooms and agreements about who could take what, things that feel like the heart of family, but that need a ledger to be kept fair. Lena agreed to a process that would protect her choices and my belongings. It was not a moment of dramatic reconciliation. It was a careful setting of lines. I did not attend the day the movers came to take what needed to leave. I am not a person made for spectacle. I believed that an absence would remove the possibility of an ugly scene. I thought the work could be done with civility if the law and the movers did their parts. Roman and a deputy oversaw the inventory. Men carried boxes beneath gray skies and placed them in trucks like reluctant archivists. The movers were professional and kind in a way that made me think of how people carry other people's lives like fragile china. They asked where to put certain boxes. I had labeled mine for clarity. They respected the tags and did not pry into the contents. There is a subtle dignity in being treated by strangers with competence. Returning to the house after the movers left felt like stepping into a postscript. There were rooms that echoed differently now, and furniture that had been rearranged to reflect who it stayed.
The green velvet armchair was there, slightly indented where my weight fit. The radio sat on its shelf, waiting. I opened windows to let the stale air sweep out. There is something about the smell of fresh paint and citrus cleaner that feels redemptive. I set to work, as one does on a restoration, but not because the house had been damaged by force.
rather because walls that have been occupied by conflict ask to be reasserted into peace. Cleaning is a form of prayer I often practice. The scouring of countertops, the plump of a pillow, the folding of curtains, all of it returns the domestic world to a scale where I can breathe. I moved a stack of newspapers into the recycling bin and found, pressed between them, an old program from a county fair where my husband had once sat with a ribbon in his lap. I laughed softly and folded it into a drawer. Small discoveries are a way the past remembers us. They have the effect of making a room feel mine again without the need to announce it. Painting was the most meditative of my tasks. I chose colors not to erase memory, but to make new surfaces for living. A pale dove gray for the hallway, a warm cream for the breakfast nook, and a soft blue for the study where I keep my records. The act of brushing long strokes across a wall has the same temper as signing a deed. It's an action that says you intend to stay. The rhythm of the brush settled my shoulders into a posture I had not realized I missed. Lena came by that afternoon with coffee and a sandwich. She wore a coat that belonged to someone who had learned thrift and dignity. We worked in companionable silence, pausing only to measure for a nail. There were small ceremonial repairs beyond painting. I rewired the radio so the late-night jazz came in clear. I replaced a broken vase in the hallway and filled it with the flowers Betty had brought. I mended a button on Lena's cardigan for no other reason than the joy of doing something that is not counted in a ledger. These acts were not triumphal. They were restorations of a life that belongs to me and that I would continue to share on my own terms. The neighborhood meeting was at first a domestic decision dressed as civic duty. Zoe came with chairs and a recipe for lemon bars. Betty brought a notebook and a long list of questions. Olga arrived late, hands on her hips, with her usual quip about men and maps. I had thought such a meeting would be simple. Call the neighbors, explain how deeds work, tell them to keep original papers safe. Instead, it became a conversation about idiosyncratic lives and the small ways we leave openings to be taken advantage of. Betty told a story about nearly signing a paper in a lawyer's office where the air was warm with persuasion. She had almost given away the title to an heirloom garden. Zoe talked about her mother, who had been slipped out of control of her funds by a man who knew where the bank book hid. Each story felt like a shard of glass smoothed into a bead of warning.
I used the meeting to teach without lecturing. I showed them what a deed looked like, the corner where the county stamp sat, the margin where the clerk wrote the date of recording. I explained, again, not as instruction but as testimony, that knowing where originals live can be as important as knowing the taste of your morning tea. I reiterated that I had used a lawyer and that any actions I had taken were in consultation with a professional who could speak to the law in our county. The women nodded and took notes. They asked practical questions about safes, about where to store documents, about whether a digital copy would suffice. I answered with anecdote and suggestion, and I closed by saying plainly that a lawyer is a necessary ally when homes are contested. As the weeks passed, Lena's life began to rearrange itself with a careful honesty. She sought counseling, not because I demanded it, but because she wanted to understand how she had come to live the life Derek offered her. The reckoning was not dramatic. It was the work of small admissions and the returning of things to their proper places. She moved into a small apartment while the legal matters continued, keeping only a few items at my house. She visited often, and we would drink tea and discuss catalogs and the odd ways people speak about property. There was a strange grief that accompanied the clearing, a recognition that family is not always permanently contiguous. People we love can make choices that distance themselves from our lives. My task was not to punish, but to make boundaries that protected the home's integrity and my own dignity. Boundaries are not walls so much as gates that you can open when you want and close when you need. We learn to pass between them with mutual respect. The accounting Andrew requested eventually produced a result that helped Lena make decisions. It was not the triumph of a detective story. It was probate work and bank reconciliation, dry and precise. The broker's statements had entries that did not correspond to any family understanding. Some funds were gone. Some had been moved into speculative accounts. It was painful to see numbers on a page that represented years of a life reduced to a ledger entry. Yet there was also relief. Clarity has the capacity to free someone who has been living under fog. When the final order for possession was put into motion, I made sure to be away. There is a particular lack of drama in law when it is handled well. Roman and a deputy oversaw the process. Boxes were cataloged, certain items were left untouched as negotiated. The sheriff's presence cut the possibility of confrontation in two. It was quiet,
except for the creak of a dolly and the distant sound of a truck door sealing. I mixed a pot of stew that evening and sat on the back porch listening to the house settle. Returning in the days after the move-out was to inhabit a different kind of domestic time.
The house had a changed pulse, like an old watch cleaned and oiled. I arranged the living room in a way that seemed to declare my tastes again. The green velvet armchair returned to its place of honor, the radio placed where its light could catch the dusk. I put a photograph of my husband back on the mantel and polished the brass candlesticks until they caught the light like small suns. There was a satisfaction, not in victory, but in order. Life is not a cinematic restoration, however. There were practical follow-ups, calls to adjust titles where necessary, calls to the bank, follow-up meetings with Andrew to ensure the inventory list matched what was removed. I made notes to have my will reviewed and to make copies of the deed stored in a safety deposit box. I had learned something essential in the recorder's office. Redundancy is a kind of wisdom. Keep copies in more than one place. Name trustworthy people to stand with you. Do not rely on memory for the things that law requires to be remembered. One evening, I hosted a small gathering for the women who had been my neighbors in the crisis: Betty, Zoe, Olga, and a few others who had shown up with casseroles and quiet hands. We sat in the kitchen and talked about things that bore no legal weight, but did have life weight: recipes, childhood memories, the best way to prune a rosebush. Lena came by and pulled out the quilt and spread it over the back of the armchair. She sat there and told a story about a childhood afternoon when my husband had taught her to skip stones. There was no dramatic reconciliation speech. There was tea, laughter, and the low hum of shared history. Boundaries had been kept, hospitality remained. Out of that gathering came something I had not planned: a series of small classes I began to teach at the community center. They were informal: how to find your recorded documents, where to keep originals, why it matters to label accounts, which kinds of conversations to have with your adult children about money and keys. I emphasized, as a rule, that my classes were not substitutes for legal counsel. They were a sharing of lived experience, a neighborly talk hosted by someone who had worked in the records office for years. People came with their own stories. Betty told of nearly giving away her house by accident. Zoe came to ask about the consequences of joint accounts. Olga wanted to laugh and listen and later tell someone about the lemon bars. The classes became a modest form of communal empowerment, an education of small defenses against quiet exploitation. Teaching gave me a renewed sense of purpose. It was a way to turn a painful life lesson into a gift for others. I found myself savoring the practical language again: margin, stamp, original, and remembering the clerk who had first taught me the way ink can hold a life. The work of making knowledge accessible has its own dignity. You do not need a courtroom to feel effective. Lena and I developed new rituals.
Sunday tea became a thing we did together. She would bring a small pastry or pick a radio program, and we would talk without the pressure of an audience. She started to call more, not out of guilt, but out of a refreshed affection. She visited with no expectation of keys offered. She asked first. The first time she asked to spend the night, I gave her a spare blanket and told her the story of my first job at the recorder's office. She smiled and said, "I like learning about that side of you." I think she meant she liked seeing me in my element, calm, competent, and unafraid of records. There were wrinkles. The divorce proceedings took their own thread and left their marks. These matters are seldom neat. I do not tell the legal outcomes as a moral lesson. I tell them as part of the chronology that followed Derek's claim. Some of the consequences were financial, some were personal. Lena faced her own rebuilding, which included reestablishing accounts, untangling names from titles, and finding a therapist who helped her talk through choices she had made in love. These were her steps, not mine, and I respected the pace she chose. My own rituals settled into a rhythm that felt like permission. I kept my notebook on the side table by the green armchair and wrote small entries about days: painted study, tea with Zoe, filed title copies. The notebooks have the effect of making time legible in a quiet way. They are not grand statements. They are inventories of a life gently put back together. On some nights, I would read aloud from them, which is a habit I had developed in the recorder's office when we used to read names into the ledger for clarity. The voice steadies the mind. There was a moment, months later, when I found myself in a small group at the church potluck. Someone asked what it meant to reclaim a home. I took a bite of pie and thought about how complicated the answer is. It was not something legal action or a blogged story of triumph. It was the combination of paper, community, and the refusal to be erased. It was the quiet things, like replacing a broken window latch, that said, "You are still here." It was in the return of the small details, the way the knob on the pantry door gave slightly when pressed, the familiar thud of the frying pan. Those sounds had continuity now, unmarred by a usurping voice. In the course of telling this, I want to be clear about one thing I have seen too many times.
The public imagination loves a revenge arc, a dramatic courtroom speech. Real life is quieter and more precise. The work that saves you often happens in offices with lemon oil on waiting room furniture and in the hands of clerks who stamp dates and smile with the exhaustion of people who have seen the same human mistakes plenty. My gratitude for those who did their jobs with care is as profound as any private satisfaction. There are people I forgive in small ways.
Forgiveness is not always a sweeping moral act. It is a pragmatic choice that frees you to stop rehearsing harm. I do not mean by this that I condone deceit or theft. I simply mean that I prefer my energy to be spent on tending the house and teaching my neighbors how to protect theirs. Derek remains a person with his own failings. Lena remains my daughter, learning to be a whole adult. These relationships are not tidy, but they are real. In the months after the house was restored to its rhythm, I began to think of the green velvet armchair as an altar to ordinary resilience. Sitting there with the radio low and the kettle warming on the stove, I feel the daily miracle of domestic life, the ability to choose the volume, to light candles on cold nights, to open a window and let the air change. Ownership, in the most honest sense, is not a matter of title alone. It is the daily practice of living with autonomy and the conviction that your life's details matter. Once, late in a winter afternoon, Lena sat with me and asked if she could borrow the keys for a week to house sit for a friend. I looked at her and said, with no malice, "Come when you are staying as a guest, not when you are expecting a title." She laughed, a small, renewed sound, and I felt relief and affection in equal measure. We agreed on terms, a boundary, not a firewall, and that was enough. Some mornings I still wake with a small astonishment, the way a person who has been through an earthquake might check the plaster for hairline cracks. But the house feels whole. The radio still picks up late-night jazz. The quilt is folded over the armchair. The photograph of my husband sits on the mantel, smiling like someone who would have been embarrassed by fuss, but happy in the peacefulness of a home kept in order. There are small things I do now to keep things tidy that I never did before. I make 2 copies of important papers and keep one in a safety deposit box. I tell visitors where the deed lives, not as a boast, but as a practical note. It's in the blue folder in the top drawer. I teach neighbors how to keep their own ledgers, not as legal instruction, but as a habit of attention. Habit is the small guardrail that prevents many large mistakes. Sometimes I think of my years at the county recorder's office and smile at my own predictable habits. When I cataloged property transfers, I never imagined I would one day rely on the same arsenal for my own shelter. Life has a way of looping you back into your own expertise. If there is any lesson I would offer, not as a blueprint, but as a truth, it's this. Attention to the mundane details of your life turns out to be the thing that can save you when storms come. Keep your papers organized. Know where originals sleep. Have someone you trust to call when confusion arrives. These are not guarantees. They are courtesies you pay to your future self. On an ordinary evening, a few months after the house had settled, I sat in the green velvet armchair with the remote in my lap. The remote is a small object, plastic, slightly warmed from my palm. I pressed the power, and the television glowed to life with a program I had chosen because I liked the music in the background. The volume rose to the level I liked, neither too loud nor whisper thin. I felt a clarity then that I have not always been privileged to know. Ownership is also, in its most human sense, the ability to say how loud your life should be. If this account has been of use in any way, if you have been moved by the sequence from being ordered out to ordering the record straight, then I am glad. Stories like mine are not universal manuals. They are, I hope, encouragement to see paperwork as more than annoyance and to see boundaries as acts of love toward yourself. If you find yourself in a similar place, please consult a qualified attorney who can advise in your jurisdiction and help you translate your own papers into the legal language they need to speak. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy hearing voices from different places. It's a small way we keep the world legible to one another.